the virtual conference so far. As Steve says, my name's Andy Dodman and I'm one of the Vice Presidents for PPMA. I've also got a day job and I'm the Chief HR Officer for Leeds City Council. And I'm really delighted to facilitate our next session. And it's going to be led by Michelle Hart. Michelle is a hugely experienced HR practitioner. She's also founder of HRS and describes herself as a compassionate leadership advocate. And as Steve said, Michelle's going to share with her her Elevate model, which is designed really to enable organisational performance and effectiveness through compassion. So I think that's a very live and very topical theme for us as HR practitioners. Before I hand over to Michelle, I'm hoping we'll have a bit of opportunity at the end of the session for questions. So as before, please do use the chat functionality and Michelle and myself will pick out stuff. Michelle is happy though, if you've got any really burning questions midway through, do shout up and she'll be happy to pause and ask and answer them as we progress. So really hoping this will be a great session to lead us into lunch. So warm welcome to you, Michelle, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Andy. And I'm just going to share my screen. Just want to check everybody can see that okay? Great, great stuff. Okay, thank you very much for having me. I have spoken for PPMA before at a webinar around compassionate leadership, and it's really nice to be invited back. And just hearing the back end of Fiona's presentation, this key area of feeling a sense of belonging at work is really gathering pace. And I've been having a number of conversations across the country, not only in the local government space, but also in the NHS and university space, about the importance of this. And increasingly, I'm seeing a link with performance. So today, I thought that that would be a really good focus area for you. There is a video that comes as part of your goodie bag that I've already supplied, which has the full slides, but I may run through some dependent upon time. So, but you will get a flavour of the kind of work that I do. So first of all, I wanted to just concentrate on what I'd like you to think about during the session. And I always think that context is important. And as I heard in the previous session, you know, your stakeholders and who you serve, it should be first and foremost in the mind, really, when you're thinking about performance. So that could be in circle 1, leaders and managers. It could be in circle 3, the staff. This example is the NHS. But obviously in circle 2 at the bottom here, that could be patients, parents of children. It could be a wide variety of different people. And some of the NHS stakeholders obviously cross over into local government, and NHS have really sort of been in the space of compassionate leadership for some time. So just a little bit about what I'll cover. I'm going to cover about compassionate leadership and its relationship with performance. I've developed a model called Elevate, which I use as a foundation for my work, which I will share with you today. I share some books and links, and finally, how you can stay in touch with me. So I wanted to start just with what compassionate leadership is before I think about how it relates to performance. And first of all, I want to talk about 3 key areas, really. The first one is Professor Michael West, who is well established in the NHS space around compassionate leadership. And he talks about ditching that command and control type of management behaviour for something that's more about sort of honest and open and enabling conversations. I think we were all a little bit guilty about slipping back into command and control, understandably, during the COVID period. But now, as we're starting to get back to our normal routines, as agile working is really taking pace, We need more, we need better ways to communicate with one another. And the Centre for Compassionate Leadership supports this. It's based in the US, and it supports the flourishing of everyone within the culture, and that is the idea behind it. And then finally, just an acknowledgement really that life isn't linear, and that everybody from time to time goes through experiences that sometimes are unexpected or are long term, that sometimes affects our ability to connect and our ability to perform. And so compassionate leadership looks at how we can create that psychological safe culture, which I know my Fiona was talking about, to be able to try and relieve some of that suffering and ideally prevent it. So when I think about performance in the compassionate leadership space, I don't just think about aims and objectives. I think it's about the whole piece. It's about the whole human being. It's about what else is going on. And also it's about creating an environment where you can have honest conversations with candor. I don't know if people saw a program the other night. My husband is obsessed with space, so anything to do with NASA is on our TV screen. And there was a program about Katie Coleman, who is a former astronaut on a space station with NASA. And even in those difficult, complicated environments, you see that compassionate leadership is really, really important, because obviously on a space station, you're there months and months and months with people. You need to get on, you need to communicate, and there might be issues where you need to work together. And so when I think about people saying to me, we don't have time to do it, we don't have the capacity to do it, I always think about that astronaut situation, because I can't think of a more difficult situation than being, you know, an astronaut in space. So if they can do it, then so can we. Also, very topical at the moment, if people have been watching Inside the RAF on the Top Guns program, again, you really see that sense of camaraderie, and you see that sense of people working together for a common cause. Okay, the cause might be brutal, but they are still compassionate with one another and supporting one another within that space. So I was looking at this in a bit of detail, and the Harvard Business Review with Hugard and Carter in 2022 developed this model as part of their potential project. And what they found was that there are essentially 4 boxes that people tend to go in. And we can change dependent upon our mood and dependent upon the situation we find ourselves in. For example, if you have a really busy task that you need to do, you can go into box 4, because what you're doing is you've got so much going on that you can forget to think about the people that you need to take on the journey with you. Equally, if you're in a situation where you're managing performance, for example, it's very easy to go into caring avoidance, where we let empathy be a barrier to action. So often there is a myth around compassionate leadership that it's soft and fluffy, but in actual fact, what we're saying is we don't need to stop doing the things we need to do. We don't need to stop managing performance. We don't need to stop restructuring or doing redundancies or whatever we need to be doing. But what we need to think about is how we can do those things in a human way. And for weeks, I had this diagram on my desk because it really reminded me about being in that box 2 space and trying as much as we can to try and stay within those parameters. And it's just important to say as well that there is a link between compassion and empathy, obviously, but compassion takes it one stage further, which is basically that you are willing to support somebody, and as well as understanding the other person's experience. So it does go beyond that empathy space, which is I feel with you, and into that space where it is that I'm here to help. And that could be, you know, giving people targets broken down to help support them. It could be going out for a walk if they're feeling not quite themselves. It can be any of those kind of things. So compassion is always about action. And a compassionate leader is multidimensional. So there are a number of things that make up a compassionate leader. And obviously they need to be introspective and think about how their beliefs might impact the world around them and other people. But they are empathetic, they collaborate, they're team players, they're hopeful and optimistic, and actually they are quite adaptable and resilient. So it's not about that soft and fluffy terminology. It's about people who are resilient, but are resilient in a way that helps them to support others. So thinking about performance, McKinsey and Company quite recently in 2022 did a survey of a number of respondents, and it was a global survey called Great Attrition, Great Attraction. And as you can see, there are a number of things that influence people leaving organisations, and you can just see how many of them are related to performance management and the performance process. You can see quite clearly that a lack of career development is very, very key, as well as poor leadership and lack of meaningful work and unsustainable expectations and unsupportive colleagues. So there are a number of things around the performance management process which actually influences not only that person's ability to perform, but that person's ability to stay within an organisation. And as you can see from things like unsupportive colleagues and poor leadership, you can see how much compassion could really make a difference to those colleagues. If you're not convinced yet, there's also some really compelling business cases around this. I'm only using the NHS purely because it's the most dramatic examples. And this is some work by Michael West in 2021. And what he found was that between 35 and 50% of the people that were surveyed in his study had high-level burnout, which you can imagine, you know, sort of mid-COVID was understandable, if not possibly underreported. Then there were burnt-out physicians who, due to high-level burnout, were more than double likely to make a medical error of a major kind. So this just wasn't the minor medical errors, this was major medical errors. Of 1,000 medical students they interviewed, they found that high compassion was often associated with low burnout. And then of 7,500 physicians, low compassion was found to cause more burnt out and more distressed people. And then finally, around A&E doctors, what was found was that if you were giving compassion to others, i.e. your stakeholders, in the case of NHS would be patients, then that in itself was a buffer against stress. So when people say to me, you know, I don't have time or the capacity to deal with things in a compassionate way, it's actually a false economy, because what happens is it stores up trouble, and then you might have to spend more time dealing with grievances, mediations, disciplinary issues that arise from not taking a compassionate approach. Similarly, there was a study by Hugard and Carter, roughly the same time. They found that if you were a compassionate leader, you were promoted faster, because the type of leaders that are needed for organisations now are those that have a compassionate edge. Amongst leaders, they found that if they had exercised compassionate leadership with their teams, 66% experienced lower stress, 200% had lower intention of quitting, and in relation to company performance, it actually increased by 14%. And then finally, there was greater job engagement. So I just want to pause at that point, really, and just see if anybody either in the chat or coming on mic has any views or thoughts about what I've shared so far. Okay, just got something from Fiona here. Connection, connection, connection would be my mantra. Difficult in a home working environment, but it's even more needed now. So that's a really great example. Anybody else want to share anything? Okay, well, I'll carry on. Okay, so when I come on to thinking about how you can be compassionate, connection is becoming increasingly more vital. And what we're finding is teams are having to work horizontally more rather than vertically in silos. And with this, we don't have the same power balance because we don't have the same ability to influence other teams. So our compassionate leadership skills have needed to increase and become much more of a requirement. So connection has become increasingly vital. And what we're finding as well is people are also working more autonomously. And we found during the COVID period that if command and control is adopted in teams, we can expect the highest sort of level that people get to is expertise amongst the team. But often now in local government, we talk about transformation and we talk about being creative and daring and exercising high levels of initiative. But those things only can be accessed if people want to be able to do it. So the more we humanize an organization, the more we can maximize the contribution that people make. Appraisals, however, still often work in hierarchical structures. They're often still once a year, even though there are changes, sometimes with some interims in between, and they are not responsive to change and are often a paper chasing exercise. They're also largely historically based, can be a negative experience because you're reinforcing situations that you've already talked about. Don't tend to look across the team and can be largely individually focused rather than team focused. And I recently attended a meeting with, an event with Michael West, who put to the NHS colleagues that would it make more sense in a more agile climate now to look more at the approach of the team appraisal and ensuring that and when we talk about team, we could be talking about horizontal teams as well as vertical teams to see how those teams work together and connect with one another. Because performance tends to be reliant on other teams and we can't necessarily unblock these blockers that can get in the way if we don't look at the whole piece. We may not be there yet in some organisations, we may be all the way there yet in others, but some suggestions if you're not doing it already might be that regular stand-ups in a morning from 2 to 5 minutes per person can happen very easily in an agile climate, and you can assess the mood of people as well as what work they have on, and that can be across horizontal teams. It doesn't have to be across vertical teams. When setting objectives, we can start with the team horizontally to see what needs to be done holistically and think about what blockers might get in the way. When we're having these appraisal discussions, as a leader, rather than focusing on a specialism that we might be really good at, we need to take or adopt the 80-20 rule, which is about 80% listening and 20% talking. So it might be around posing questions like, how can I help you? What blockers can I remove? And how can I make you feel more enabled? And finally, the annual approach really question whether it has any merit and whether the regular discussions is more of a thing that needs to happen. When we look at business blockers and enablers, Johnson and Scholes culture web is quite a common diagram, and we see that things that can block things are power structures, not just organisational structures. So the people that hold power in the organisation have the greatest influence, and sometimes they are not necessarily the people that lead the teams. There are also things that are visual representations of the organisation, which might go from logos down to dress codes, and sometimes the way that we present ourselves in advertisements. Then there are the ritual routines, the behaviours of people day to day. And I'm sure you've all seen the iceberg model where, you know, you see what's on the surface, but then sometimes we need to dig beneath the surface and see what the values are of the teams. What are their shared values, and what do they believe they need in their department or their team? And then finally, you've got the stories and the myths, the people that say, well, we've been here before, we've done this before, it was better back in a previous time. So all of these things can influence how we can suddenly become disheartened, or we can think, well, this is too difficult. And so having those conversations and regularly listening to the teams enables us to find out what's really going on and what might be getting in the way of performance. So that's where my Elevate model comes in. This is something that I designed based on a lot of research and a lot of reading. And I just felt that there's a lot of academia around the compassionate leadership space, but I felt it needed a pracademic. It needed someone to take some of the academic stuff, but apply it to a practical space. So my background's HR. So I've been in a lot of situations where these skills were paramount, certainly in terms of restructures, redundancies and consultations. Sometimes the lack of HR at the table at the beginning of a process meant that some of the people elements were almost left to one side and were very procedural. So it doesn't have to be just used in the performance management space. It can be used across a variety of HR processes and procedures. Maybe it's your absence procedures, for example. And it spells the word Elevate. It's an acronym, and essentially it's empathise, listen, engage, be visible, appreciate others, and trust. And finally, in the middle is the embed, which is basically that you create a culture of feedback. One of my colleagues, Stephen Hargreaves, talks about the fact that culture is something that you craft. It's something that is quite deliberate. And if you don't say what your ideals are, people form their own ideals that may not align with your principles. So really embedding a culture of feedback is really, really vitally important. So just quickly going through it, and I'm going to go at a whistle stop speed because I am conscious of time. The first E is for empathise, and as Fiona said in the previous presentation, we need to be able to have that psychological safety, and psychological safety does not necessarily be in your team. It's whoever you feel comfortable with. And what I always say is that without making a compassionate leadership foundation, you're unlikely to get that psychological safety that leads to greater inclusion, greater diversity, and ultimately greater performance. So it is about setting your stall and making things as accessible and easy for people as possible. My colleague Stephen Hargreaves, who I mentioned again, who by the way has an excellent book around this, talks about if you want to service your car, you don't send it out without the engine tuned or with the best fuel in it or without having an updated map. And you don't send people out who aren't well rested or well fed. So what you need to do is deal with all of the basic psychological and emotional needs of your team, as well as their own personal and individual needs. And this is fantastic. I love this imagery. It's the psychological hierarchy of needs. So I'm sure you've all, with your CIPD qualification, done Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But this looks at how the psychology side works. So really, things like from your basic safety needs, which is about not being micromanaged or having double standards, or being in a blame or a gossip culture, right the way through to the top, where you get to self-fulfillment needs, where you feel safe to challenge, safe to be authentic, safe to collaborate, safe even to be vulnerable. And safe to apply leadership skills. And Heidi Pickett, who talks about this, believes that we need to think about all of these areas of the pyramid in order to create a psychologically safe team. And if we have a psychological safe team and we also have a very clear performance standards, we find ourselves in the learning zone where people can collaborate and learn and really do that complex, creative, transformational, innovative work, because they don't feel frightened of making mistakes or trying new things. I must say, it's getting very dark in here. I think we're getting a rain cloud. So I hope you can still see me. L is for listen. What is really important is that we coach and develop our managers in thinking about the type of listening skills that are needed and working more on being more of an attentive listener. And I do think that HR has a really big role here in being able to ensure that when we are thinking about our structures, that we do have that feedback culture, that people are able to express their views and be listened to. And where we can, we accommodate or we understand or we even celebrate the ideas of other people. So I'm not going to go all the way through the diagram, but essentially, I believe we go up and down this diagram throughout the day. I know, particularly with my husband, if my 7-year-old is running around and I'm doing something, I know I'm half listening to him. And about 3 days later, he'll say, I've told you that 3 days ago. And that can happen in the workplace too. And I'm sure we've all been guilty of it. But being conscious of it and having a diagram like this in your mind makes you think, okay, I need to stop what I'm doing. I need to concentrate on the person in front of me. I don't need to be thinking about what I'm about to say. I need to pause and listen to what they're saying. I don't even need to judge it and think, well, do I agree? What's correct? What's incorrect? It's how they feel. It's their voice. It's their truth. So I think there's some really good work and some good research around this space. It's really worth spending some time with managers about those attentive listening skills. And sometimes people lack confidence as well. I have had imposter syndrome. I'm sure a number of you have. And when it gets you, it doesn't matter how high performing you are, all of a sudden you can suddenly lose belief in yourself. And it's through having those conversations that sometimes you need to coach people and you need to say, well, actually, this is the experience, this is the reality, you know, and help them get back that belief. And this involves as well appreciating the difference of people. And this is my second E, the E for the engage. Understanding that people are completely different as a fingerprint. If you look at all these different examples on the board, we're all different spiritually, emotionally, financially, for sure, particularly in recent times. And it is okay to have those differences. And we are realizing more and more that people who have different invisible, if you like, neurodiverse conditions can also be impacted by the traditional model of performance. And just in case you were wondering why Mr. Bump is appearing on the screen, the story of Mr. Bump is that essentially he had a series of jobs that didn't suit him. And eventually at the end of the book, he was somebody who collected apples because he could bump into the trees and the apples would fall. And I just think about that in relation to neurodiversity, and that actually sometimes people are suited to particular jobs because of particular traits that they may possess and that they may not know about fully yet. And it's just understanding when we're looking at performance that sometimes we do need to think about it from the perspective, if you like, of Mr. Bump, that not every job suits every person. Visibility comes in there, and I don't need to tell any of you that the world has changed and people communicate differently, particularly the younger generation are really, you know, into some of these more social areas like TikTok. I have been on TikTok, but I find it quite scary, I'll be honest. But you know, that's the way that our youngsters, for a better word, now like to sometimes communicate, and sometimes understanding that dialogue. My last workplace was the first workplace we ever used WhatsApp, and we were WhatsApp chatting about things, not necessarily work, all the way through the lockdown. And it really helped. So sometimes it's not necessarily the face-to-face that works. Whatever works, be it virtual or face-to-face. A little note on appreciation. I share some tips for recognizing others, and there are, you know, the main thing is to routinely encourage and not to dilute it, give it when it's earned, and don't rationalize it. Sorry, don't ration it rather. So again, this is from the source called the Chief Executive, and really it's a really important skill, really, to recognize other people and to celebrate other people, and to ensure that members of your team feel that you celebrate what they do, because if you don't, obviously they won't want to work and won't want to do the things that the team needs to do. I share something that I used a lot at Birmingham City Council. It's not mine, but I know it works. And essentially, this is the AID model, which they use. I don't know if anyone from Birmingham is on the call. But essentially, we tried to create a feedback culture across the organisation. It was particularly used in adult social care. And what the model did was people would be able to give feedback by saying, first of all, are you happy for me to give you some AID feedback? And therefore it broke the nervousness, if you like, of giving the feedback. And we use that a lot. It was really, really impactful. Sometimes it was to give constructive feedback. Sometimes it was to give feedback to say that you've done a good job, and it was recognition feedback. And just in case people are struggling or want to give a model to their managers to follow, it's something that I highly recommend and regularly use across my work. T is for trust. When you get my slides, I'm sure you do get my slides. When you do get my slides, I have done an exercise where I've cut these things out and I've passed them around teams. And I know it's a funny word to use, the word permission, but even in cultures that are quite open, people still wonder whether they're allowed to do things or not. So what's good is to sometimes assess how your team feels about things. Are people able to fail miserably and learn magnificently? Are people allowed to trust the process or try something new or step outside their comfort zone? And it's a way to start the dialogue about, well, do we need to be more open as a team? Do we need to be more receptive as a team to new ideas? So it's one that's worth doing, and certainly you may be surprised by some of the answers that you get. But we're all work in progress, and it may lead to much more open conversations. And finally, as I said, E is for embed. This is the employment life cycle. And at each of these touch points, you have the opportunity to make a difference and add value, right the way through from how you advertise, how you get people into your organisation, the way you onboard, how you recruit, right the way through to ambassadors at exit. You do have the opportunity to make a difference to a person and the skills and the performance that they give to their organisation. So there are some books and links, as always, with me that are worth reading. And then just to say, that's my model. You're more than welcome to use it if you think it is of benefit. And finally, I did a deal with PPMA to offer 25% discount on my online products. So I do have a series of videos that are 30 minutes to 40 minutes in length. And if you are interested, you can download them and you get 25% discount till the end of October. Thank you so much for your time. Those are my contact details on screen, and it's been a pleasure talking today, and happy to take questions as always.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I think you've covered a huge amount of ground in a very short period of time, so thank you. Very rich and thoughtful presentation. We do have some questions, and we've got about sort of 5 or 6 minutes. One question came up on the chat, Michelle, which is a really good question about is compassion an innate skill, or is it something that should be or could be taught to leaders and managers and members of staff? So I don't know if you've got a view on that.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I have had some debates actually online on social media about people saying that it can be used to manipulate others, and I am quite sure that that can go on. I'm not going to deny that. I personally feel it's an innate skill, and the reason why I believe that in most people, I would say, is that during COVID, I saw some wonderful examples of compassion. And it wasn't that we were going out and saying to people, be compassionate to each other. It was something that people did naturally. So I saw examples of people having pizza nights and work socials and all sorts of different ways that people connected. Personally, I was reading children's stories to social workers' children so that they could have a break. There was all sorts of things that were going on. And so I do believe that it's something that is innate. Sometimes it gets lost at work. I would say that people from a sort of more mature generation were probably taught to leave all your personal stuff at home, to be very, your professional edge. So it's probably more difficult sometimes, but I do believe it's still there. So I think that's a long way of saying yes.
No, thank you, Michelle. I suppose a question from me, just on a sort of slightly related point. I guess your take, Michelle, on if individuals on the call did want to adopt the Elevate model that you've shared with us, is it, from your experience, is it something that you implement through doing and role modeling, or is it something that lends itself to doing a good old-fashioned HR trick, which is you develop a sort of top-down corporate initiative and apply it down the organisation, or do you do a bit of the bottom-up and top-down? Any thoughts on that, Michelle?
Yeah. I mean, it depends on what you're using it for. I think sometimes when we've got to make something resonate. One of the issues with HR sometimes is that we do talk in a very sort of intellectual dialogue that's very related to our specialism. So I wanted something that was practical. So I think it can be used operationally or strategically, being totally honest. But what I've been doing is I've been holding workshops of 2 hours with sort of middle management giving them the opportunity to have this model to use. And I suppose it's like an aid memoir, really. But yeah, I mean, strategically, if you're putting together something, for example, like a wellbeing strategy or a diversity, equity and inclusion strategy, I think it just serves as a reminder of making those things human and personable, and the approach that you take. So if you were doing an engagement strategy, you've got to engage. I know that sounds common sense, but I have seen situations where we ask people for their views, they give their views, and then we think the exercise is done. And actually, it's about translating what we receive, and not creating the wish list for everybody, but being able to help them do their job better. So I would say there are elements of strategic and operational things that you can use the model for.
Great. No, thank you, Michelle. Steve's asked a question in the chat as well. Just recognising that you shared some different elements on compassionate leadership, so empathy, understanding, performance management, and just understand about the blend there between those different skills. Is there a typical blend, or is it a bit of everything? Any thoughts on that? Well,
I think listening is at the heart of it all, really. I think you know, if you can empathize with the situation, that's great. Even if you can't empathize, you've got to kind of try and put yourself in the shoes of someone else. So that does involve a degree of understanding. But the key difference, obviously, with compassion is that you are then compelled to do something. Sometimes that doing is very small. It could be just listening to somebody or talking to somebody, but sometimes we have, situations, particularly in the HR world, where we may need to involve other people or signpost. So that, to me, is the difference, is the extra layer. But of course, you need those skills like understanding and empathy to get to that point in the first place. And that psychological safety element is really key.
Right. Thank you, Michelle. I think we've probably got about 1 minute left, so I don't know if anybody else wishes to come in with any last minute questions or observations, either on the chat or shouting up.
I did notice a comment on imposter syndrome, by the way, from Fiona, and yeah, it's a really big thing at the moment. I think particularly since we've been in lockdown and coming back out of that again, having to build your confidence again to go and do things that you naturally did before, but the anxiety has sort of crept in, is something that I've seen quite a bit of and actually experienced myself. So I do think we're in interesting times.
Indeed we are. I think everybody would definitely agree with that. Thank you, Michelle.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll probably come to the end of the session. So, Michelle, thank you so much for a really rich and thoughtful presentation. I think everybody would agree it's a really important topic for us as HR practitioners and leaders. So, very, very important, very topical. So, thank you so much. Do appreciate it.